The Canadians fight like wild men. They strike in darkness. They assault in driving rain. They do not pause for losses. These were not the words of a propaganda official attempting to spread terror among civilians, nor were they exaggerated stories told by a frightened conscript. These were the cold, deliberate observations recorded in the field reports of seasoned German officers at the height of the Second World War. For the Wehrmacht, and especially for the fanatical divisions of the Waffen-SS, the Western Front became a nightmare defined by overwhelming firepower. Yet even within that nightmare, there existed a clear hierarchy of fear. When the German soldier looked across the burned fields of Normandy or the rubble-filled streets of Italy, he recognized three distinct enemies. He saw the Americans and feared their industrial might, the endless columns of tanks, skies darkened by aircraft, and the seemingly limitless supply of artillery shells capable of reducing an entire grid square to dust. He saw the British and respected their resilience, their stubborn discipline, and the crushing weight of an empire that refused to collapse after 5 years of total war. But when he encountered the Canadians, it was different. The fear inspired by Canadian infantry was not rooted in machines, nor in numbers. It was fear of the men themselves. This raises one of the most compelling questions of the entire conflict. Why? Why did the German High Command, the architects of Blitzkrieg, classify a small volunteer army from a dominion across the Atlantic as their most dangerous infantry adversary? Why, in the secret evaluations of the SS, were Canadians so often judged superior in ferocity to both Americans and British troops? The answer is not found on the grand strategic maps of generals like Eisenhower or Montgomery. It is found in the mud of the Scheldt, where men fought waist-deep in freezing water. It is found in the shattered homes of Ortona, where the conventions of civilized warfare were discarded in favor of knives and grenades. And it lies in a terrifying reputation the Canadians did not merely inherit from their fathers in the trenches of the First World War, but one they forged anew with a brutality that shocked even their allies. To understand this anomaly, we must first strip away the modern image of Canada. Today, the world sees a nation of peacekeepers defined by courtesy and diplomacy. But Canada between 1939 and 1945 was something entirely different. It was a nation forging its identity in fire. While the United States brought the immense weight of mass production to the battlefield, deploying a huge army that often relied on inexperienced conscripts to fill its rapidly expanding ranks, Canada chose a different path. The Canadian Army was small, fielding only 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades in Europe. Yet what it lacked in size, it compensated for with a terrifying concentration of lethality. Unlike the American system of constant troop rotation, or the British model strained by exhaustion after fighting largely alone since 1940, the Canadians spent years waiting in Britain. They trained relentlessly. They drilled without pause. They hardened themselves. They embraced a doctrine of shock infantry, a philosophy that emphasized aggression, initiative, and violent momentum over caution. By the time they were unleashed against Fortress Europe, the average Canadian soldier was not merely a volunteer, he was a tightly wound spring of suppressed aggression. The Germans quickly understood that these were not men who fought only for ground. They fought with a personal intensity that was deeply unsettling. Where an American unit might call in an airstrike to eliminate a machine gun nest, and a British unit might attempt a careful flanking maneuver, German troops discovered that Canadian units were shockingly willing to close the distance, charging positions head-on under conditions other armies considered impossible. This contrast was unmistakable to the enemy. Intelligence reports captured from the German 71st Infantry Division in Italy recorded a noticeable collapse in morale once soldiers realized they were facing the Canadians. The Americans kill you with their equipment. The British kill you with their persistence. The Canadians kill you because they want to. This video is not just a chronicle of battles. It is an investigation into why the Wehrmacht, the most professional army of the 20th century, feared the sight of the maple leaf patch. We will walk through the swamp of death in the Scheldt, the little Stalingrad of Ortona, and the killing fields of Normandy to uncover the ruthless truth that history often overlooks. The Canadians were the Allies. Shock troops, the ones called upon to do the dirty work that no one else could or would do. To understand the depth of the German apprehension, one must look past the propaganda reels and into the dusty archives of the Wehrmacht field. Communications. It is here in the hurried typewriter written report sent from the front lines back to Berlin that the true image of the Canadian soldier emerges. It was an image defined not by the gallantry of knights, but by the ruthlessness of predators. German doctrine was built on precision, timing, and the superiority of their stormtrooper tactics. They were accustomed to enemies who fought by a recognizable rhythm. The British, for instance, were known to pause. They would secure an objective, consolidate, have tea, and wait for supply lines to catch up. It was a predictable cadence that gave German commanders time to regroup and plan counterattacks. The Canadians, however, refused to play by these rules. A captured intelligence assessment from a panzer division in Italy noted a disturbing trend. The Canadians fight aggressively and without pity. They do not recognize the natural pauses of battle. This was the first pillar of the German fear, the relentless pursuit. When the sun went down, the battlefield was supposed to sleep. Night operations were notoriously difficult, chaotic, and dangerous. Most Allied commanders preferred to dig in and wait for dawn. But the Canadians, drawing on a rugged adaptability perhaps forged in the harsh wilderness of their homeland, owned the night. They became masters of the nocturnal raid. German centuries learned that darkness offered no safety. In fact, it was when the wild men were most likely to strike. A German paratrooper Fulcher Jäger captured near Ortona confessed that they could never relax against the Canadians because they move like ghosts and strike with knives. Then there was the weather in the European theater. Rain and mud were supposed to be the great equalizers, the forces that bogged down offensives and forced stalemates. But reports from the Scheldt estuary, a campaign fought in appalling conditions of flooding and freezing mud, reveal a Wehrmacht in disbelief. They attack in weather no one should fight in. One officer wrote, while other armies waited for clear skies to leverage their air support, the Canadians advanced through driving rainstorms and waist-deep mire to the German defender shivering in his foxhole, seeing an enemy emerge from the gloom of a freezing storm was psychologically shattering. It signaled that there was no sanctuary, no element of nature that could save them. But it wasn't just sheer aggression. If the Canadians were wild men in close quarters, they were cold mathematical technicians at range. This brings us to the second pillar of fear, artillery. The German army respected American artillery for its volume, but they feared Canadian artillery for its precision. Inheriting the hard-won lessons of the Canadian Corps in World War I, who had perfected counter-battery fire at Vimy Ridge, the Canadian gunners of World War II were arguably the best in the Allied coalition. German veterans often compared Canadian artillery coordination to that of the Soviets, the highest complement of fear they could bestow. The Canadians didn't just fire, they orchestrated destruction. They utilized the creeping barrage with a terrifying proficiency, walking a curtain of exploding shells just yards in front of their advancing infantry. For a German soldier, this meant there was no gap, no moment to lift his head and man his machine gun between the shelling stopping and the infantry arriving. The moment the explosion ceased, the Canadians were already in the trench, bayonets fixed. A Wehrmacht report from the Rhineland succinctly warned its troops, if the shelling stops, do not look up. They are already there. Perhaps most unnerving of all was the Canadian refusal to retreat. In the fluidity of mobile warfare, tactical withdrawals were common. If a unit was outflanked or hit hard, it pulled back to save lives. Yet time and again, German counterattacks, the famous Gagen, that was the hallmark of German defense, would slam into Canadian lines and shatter. At Verrières Ridge in Normandy against the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps, lesser units might have crumbled under the weight of Tiger tanks and fanatical infantry. The Canadians bent. They bled. Horrific numbers, but they did not break. They held ground with a stubbornness that defied tactical logic. To the German mind, which prided itself on military logic, this obstinacy was maddening. It turned minor skirmishes into grinding wars of attrition that the dwindling German forces could not afford to fight. However, there is a darker shadow cast over this reputation, one that goes beyond tactics and grit. As the war dragged on, a cycle of violence emerged between Canadian units and the vain SS that spiraled into something personal. It wasn't just about taking ground anymore. In the hedge of Normandy, after rumors and evidence of Canadian prisoners being executed by the SS began to circulate, a grim resolve settled over the Canadian ranks. The phrase, "take no prisoners," began to be whispered and practiced. The Germans realized that in the Canadians, they were facing an enemy who had tapped into a reservoir of cold fury. They weren't fighting reluctant draftees. They were fighting men who had crossed an ocean to settle a score. This psychological edge is what led a German commander to issue a stark warning to his replacements: be careful of the Americans. They have the tanks. But be terrified of the Canadians, for they have the hate. Yet, this general reputation was only the prelude. The true test of this fear would be written in blood in three specific nightmares: a flooded estuary, a medieval town turned into a slaughterhouse, and a beach of doom. Reputation is one thing. Reality is another. The German fear of the Canadian infantry wasn't built on rumors whispered in mess halls, but on the hard, undeniable facts of the battlefield. As the war progressed, a pattern emerged in Allied high command. When a target was deemed too difficult, too heavily defended, or the terrain too treacherous for standard operations, the order was often given: send in the Canadians. This role as the fixers of the Allied line placed the Canadian Army in some of the most hellish environments of the war, forging their legacy in three distinct crucibles of fire. The first was Ortona, Italy in December 1943. To the German paratroopers of the elite 1st Parachute Division defending it, Ortona was a fortress. Narrow medieval streets, stone buildings with thick walls, and rubble piled high created a sniper paradise. It was a trap designed to bleed an attacking army dry. The British 8th Army had stalled. The Americans were engaged elsewhere. It fell to the Canadians to break the deadlock. What followed was a battle of such savagery that journalists dubbed it Little Stalingrad. But it was here that the Germans learned a terrifying lesson about Canadian ingenuity, realizing that stepping onto the street meant instant death from German snipers. The Canadians reinvented urban warfare. They developed a tactic known as mouse hauling. Instead of using the doors or windows, Canadian soldiers would blast a hole through the attic wall of a building into the adjoining house. They would throw in grenades, spray the room with submachine gun fire, and then scramble through the dust and smoke to clear the room in brutal hand-to-hand combat. They moved through the entire town without ever touching the cobblestones of the streets. The German defenders were baffled. They were prepared to fight an enemy who advanced along the roads. They were not prepared for an enemy who ate their way through the walls like termites of concrete and steel. The ferocity of the close quarters combat in Ortona, fought with knives, bayonets, and bare hands, shook the confidence of the elite Falsamager. They had met their match not in superior numbers, but in sheer gutter fighting toughness. If Ortona was a nightmare of stone, the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944 was a nightmare of mud. This was perhaps the defining moment of the Canadian War effort and the one most illustrative of why the Germans feared them. The Allies desperately needed the port of Antwerp to supply their armies, but the approaches were controlled by Dugin German fortifications amidst a flooded, reclaimed landscape. The terrain was abysmal. Flat, flooded boulders, waist-deep freezing water, and mud that swallowed men whole. It was a suicide mission. The British armored divisions could not operate there. The Americans were focused on the drive to the Rhine. Once again, the job went to the 1st Canadian Army. German commanders defending the Scheldt called it the Swamp of Death. They believed the terrain itself was their greatest ally, rendering any infantry assault impossible. They were wrong. The Canadians attacked. They attacked across open dikes swept by machine gun fire. They attacked through water that turned red with blood. They utilized vehicles like the Buffalo, amphibious carriers, but mostly they used grit. The psychological impact on the German defenders was profound. To see an enemy advancing steadily through an icy flood, ignoring mines and mortars, creates a sense of inevitability. It broke the German will. A captured German major remarked that while the American soldier fought well when he had a dry pair of socks and a hot meal, the Canadian soldier fought as if the misery of the elements was his natural habitat. By clearing the Scheldt, the Canadians didn't just open a port. They proved that there was no terrain on Earth where they could not kill. And then there was Normandy. While D-Day is often remembered for the American carnage at Omaha, the Canadian landing at Juno Beach was equally perilous, facing bunkers, seawalls, and a rising tide that delayed their landing craft. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division stormed ashore directly into the teeth of the Atlantic Wall. Yet, by the end of that longest day, the Canadians had penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied force, American or British. But the true horror and the true forging of the reputation came in the days that followed. In the Hedgeross of Caen, here they met the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a unit composed of fanatical teenagers led by hardened Eastern Front veterans. The fighting was primal. It was fueled by a mutual, festering hatred. After the SS executed Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes, the nature of the war changed. Word spread through the Canadian ranks like wildfire. The rules of war were discarded. The Canadians stopped taking prisoners. The SS, used to intimidating their foes, found themselves facing an enemy who returned their fanaticism with a cold, efficient fury. The Canadians earned a reputation among the SS, not just as soldiers, but as executioners. In the meat grinder battles for Caen and the Files Pocket, the Canadians were the anvil upon which the German army was smashed. The fear they inspired was so great that German units would often desperately try to surrender to British or American units on their flanks rather than face the Canadians directly in front of them. From the rubble of Ortona to the mud of the Scheldt and the hedgerows of Normandy, the message was clear. The Canadians were not just participating in the war. They were ending it one brutal yard at a time. To fully grasp the unique standing of the Canadian infantry, we must place them side by side with their brothers in arms. The Allied invasion of Europe was a coalition effort, a massive trident thrust into the heart of the Third Reich. But to the German commanders observing from their bunkers, the three prongs of this trident, American, British, and Canadian, felt very different when they pierced the skin. First, consider the Americans. By 1944, the United States Army was a force of nature. To the German High Command, the Americans represented the terrifying inevitability of industrial warfare. They possessed a logistical tale that was the envy of the world. If a German Tiger tank destroyed a column of 5 American Shermans, the next day 10 more would appear on the horizon. The German fear of the Americans was a fear of suffocation. They knew they could not win a war of attrition against a nation that could manufacture tanks faster than Germany could manufacture bullets. However, regarding the infantry, specifically, the German assessment was often critical. In the internal memos of the Wehrmacht, American infantry units were frequently described as brave but inexperienced. The U.S. Army expanded so rapidly that many units entering combat in 1944 were green. They relied heavily on their overwhelming firepower to solve tactical problems. If an American unit encountered a machine gun nest, they would often halt and call in an airstrike or a massive artillery barrage to level the entire grid square. It was effective, yes, but it was impersonal. It lacked the tactical nuance of close quarters aggression. The German soldier feared the American machine, but he believed that man for man on a level playing field, he was superior to the American GI. Then consider the British. The British Army was the seasoned veteran of the conflict. They had been fighting since 1939, enduring the humiliation of Dunkirk, the Blitz of London, and the scorching sands of North Africa. By the time they reached Normandy, the British soldier was highly disciplined, stoic, and technically proficient. But the British Army was also tired. After 5 years of total war, Britain was running out of men. This demographic reality bled into their tactical doctrine. Field Marshal Montgomery and his commanders were notoriously cautious. They fought a bite and hold style of warfare designed to minimize casualties. They would take an objective and immediately dig in, refusing to overextend. While the Germans respected the British Tommy for his tenacity in defense, they did not fear his unpredictability. They knew the British would rarely take insane risks. They were a known quantity, steady, dangerous, but methodical. And then there was the Canadian. The Canadian Army occupied a terrifying middle ground that combined the strengths of both allies while discarding their perceived weaknesses. Like the British, they were equipped with the best of the Commonwealth's doctrine and training. They were disciplined and understood how to synchronize artillery and armor with a level of sophistication equal to that of the British Army. Yet unlike the British, they were not exhausted by years of continuous war. They were fresh, possessing the high morale and physical resilience of a volunteer force that had been preparing for this moment for years. And like the Americans, they carried an aggressive, can-do attitude, a frontier mindset that prized initiative and improvisation. But unlike the Americans, they were not inexperienced. The backbone of the Canadian infantry consisted of long-serving volunteers who had refined their skills in the commando training grounds of Scotland before ever setting foot in France. This combination produced a soldier the Germans found impossible to classify and therefore impossible to counter. The Canadians fought with the technical precision of the British, yet attacked with the reckless ferocity of a newly committed American unit. German General Eberhard Kinzel, analyzing Allied forces, observed that while the British would halt to consolidate their gains, the Canadians would continue pressing forward. They practiced deep battle doctrine. When they punched through a line, they did not simply dig in, they surged into rear areas, disrupting supply routes and command centers. They were shock troops in the purest sense of the term. Moreover, there was a political element that translated directly into battlefield savagery. Canadian generals, such as Guy Simonds, were not merely fighting for terrain, they were fighting for national identity. Canada was a small nation determined to prove its value on the world stage, and its leaders demanded complex, high-prestige objectives to demonstrate what their forces could accomplish. This attitude filtered down to the ordinary soldier. They were not fighting as a subordinate arm of the British Empire, they were fighting as Canadians. This sense of national pride forged a unit cohesion that proved extraordinarily difficult to break. The German soldier experienced this difference viscerally. Facing an American sector meant enduring an artillery deluge. Facing a British sector meant a slow, grinding war of attrition. But facing a Canadian sector meant the likelihood of being attacked at night, in driving rain, by men who knew exactly how to wield their bayonets and who seemed to take a grim satisfaction in the intimate savagery of infantry combat. As one captured officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division reportedly remarked during interrogation, "We knew when we were fighting the Canadians, the fighting was harder, the shelling was closer, and there was no mercy." It was not that the Canadians were superhuman, it was that they represented the perfect convergence of training, motivation, and timing. They entered the battlefield at a moment when the Germans were vulnerable, and they struck with a hammer that was both heavy and razor-sharp. And so we return to the question that haunts the archives of the Second World War: why did the mighty Wehrmacht, the conquerors of Europe, tremble at the sight of the Canadians? It was not because the Canadian army was invincible. They bled, and they bled heavily. In fact, casualty rates among Canadian infantry units in Normandy were among the highest of any Allied force. Yet it was precisely this willingness to bleed that terrified the enemy. The Germans were students of warfare, they understood logic, tactics, and self-preservation. In the Americans, they saw a reflection of the future, a war dominated by machines and overwhelming logistics. In the British, they saw a reflection of the past, a war fought by empire and stubborn discipline. But in the Canadians, they saw something primal. They saw an enemy who fought not for abstract global strategy, but for the few yards of ground directly in front of his boots. The Canadian infantryman became the boogeyman of the Western Front because he shattered the psychological contract of modern warfare. He attacked when reason dictated he should not. He fought when retreat would have been sensible, and he carried a grudge that transformed professional soldiers into relentless avengers. From the sniper-haunted ruins of Ortona to the flooded dikes of the Scheldt, the Canadians did the dirty work. They were the shock army of the British Empire, the sledgehammer taken from its case only when the door refused to open. This reputation came at a dreadful price. Being the best meant being sent to the worst places. The names of the battles Dieppe, Ortona, Verrières Ridge, the Scheldt, the Hochwald Gap are not merely victories, they are graveyards. Yet within those graveyards, a new national identity was forged. Canada did not emerge from the Second World War as simply a British colony, it emerged as a nation tempered by fire, demanding a seat at the table not because of its size, but because of the weight of its sacrifice. For the German soldier shivering in a foxhole in 1945, watching the relentless advance of khaki-clad troops from the north, the subtleties of geopolitics were irrelevant. All that mattered was the fear, a fear that was uniquely Canadian. Perhaps the most chilling epitaph for the German experience against Canada was found not in a history book written decades later, but in the immediate, terrified assessment of a German officer from the 346th Infantry Division. As his lines collapsed and his men surrendered to the wild men they had learned to dread, he penned a final report that captured the futility of resisting them. His words echo through the decades, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the Canadian Corps. When the Americans attack, we call for artillery, when the British attack, we call for reserves, but when the Canadians arrive, we know the battle is over.